Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jonathan Page. I am the senior minister here at First Congregational Church of Houston, and we're delighted for you to join us here in the Meeting House or those who are joining us online. We're very glad that you've taken time to hear this, what's sure to be an interesting lecture on a very timely and important topic. And not only am I happy that we could host Kathryn here to speak at First Congregational, because it's a moment when these conversations need to be happening around our country, but I'm also happy that we can host her here in a place of Christian worship. So often the voices against women's reproductive rights and freedoms come from churches. So I think it's altogether appropriate, especially honoring Sylvia's memory, that we should have this lecture here in this space. And as I was coming over here, I looked at my bookshelf. Like many people, I'm sure in this room, I love books. So I look at my bookshelf, I'm like, what books do I have on women's reproductive rights, and theology? And I just pulled these two off the shelf. So here's one great one that dates back to the 80s from a legendary scholar down at Union Seminary in New York. And then here was this one, and I love this one especially for the title, Trust Women. So I think if there's a good way to start this off, that would be my word. Let's trust women. So Kathryn, welcome. We're glad you're here. And Paul.
Once again, welcome everybody. Did everybody have a chance to look at their program? Good, because that really shortens the introduction. I appreciate that. Tonight's event is this year's Sylvia Richards Memorial Lecture. Sylvia was a spiritual force in this church and deeply missed, and there's a lot more about her in the program, and I hope you read that. The committee that chooses the annual speaker looks for prominent thought leaders in the areas of peace and justice. And when the committee met this year, we decided that we were going to look for somebody who had a tradition of advocating for women's reproductive freedom. That has been challenged in this state. Well, you all know, I don't have to mention it. It's a serious issue. And so as we were looking around, we found our speaker, and she is wonderful. She's an attorney and an author who dedicated her life to advocating for that particular cause. And her talk tonight, or this afternoon, is entitled, What We Can Do Now to Save Reproductive Freedom. I hope you all can take notes here. Following her talk, there's going to be an opportunity for questions and answers. So this isn't a Baptist church. Don't shout stuff out there while she's talking, okay? Just wait. There'll be a time when you can ask questions. So please welcome Kathryn Kolbert.
Thank you. So thank you all for coming. It's a thrill to be here. I agree that it is wonderful to be discussing this issue in a church. In fact, the Protestant churches and Jewish synagogues were a real part of the reproductive rights movement. When I first started, the clergy consultation service was up and running and working very hard to provide information to women in need of abortion services when it was banned. Those were the days before Roe. And I have missed the religious voice on our side of this issue tremendously, because I think it's really, really important. And in fact, the religious voice on our side of the issue is very large, very strong, very important contribution to this debate. So I thank you for having this in a church and for my ability to come and talk with you. Since the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs versus Women's Health Organization, Jackson Women's Health Organization, I've been asked a lot about what do I think about the opinion and what do we do now to save reproductive freedom. Being in Texas, you guys were the forerunner to Dobbs. It was the Supreme Court's ruling in the challenge to the Texas law really paved the way for Dobbs. It was the first good sign we had that the 5 votes on the court who were against abortion were going to hold firm. They certainly did so in their rulings in the Texas case. And so it wasn't a surprise to me when the Dobbs decision was handed down. I say all the time, everything you know about winning or losing in the Supreme Court of the United States, you learn on Sesame Street. And why is that? Because you got to learn to count. And the only number that's important, you don't count Dracula, the only number that's important is 5. Are there a majority of the court to rule in one way? So I want to talk a little bit about my response to the opinion, because I wasn't surprised at the result. I knew that the court, I've been saying since the day after the election in 2016, that the court of the Supreme Court of the United States was prepared to overrule Roe and Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which was my case in 1992. Now, in Planned Parenthood versus Casey in 92, we expected that the court would then overturn Roe versus Wade. And they didn't, only because Justice Kennedy switched his vote at the last minute. But there is in the history of the Supreme Court, stuck in the middle of Justice Blackmun's papers, a decision written by Justice Rehnquist overturning Roe versus Wade. And so it was my view that when Dobbs came along and we were prepared for the court to overturn Roe again, that the court would be somewhat like Justice Rehnquist, relatively straightforward, couching what they did in legalese, never saying the magic word that Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey are overruled. No, not this court. And in fact, that is while I'm not surprised at the result, the first thing I was really surprised at was the way that the court overruled Roe and Casey. And what they did is, they didn't say circumstances have changed. They didn't say, we got the facts wrong or new facts have developed. What they said was that Roe and Casey were wrong from the start and need to be overruled because 5 justices, all of us, think it was wrongly decided. Now, that is a direct attack on stare decisis, because the principles of stare decisis, which has been a part of our law since the founding of our nation, says that the court ought to respect prior rulings, even if you disagree with them. You ought to respect prior rulings because the importance of the court is to have a sense of continuity, a sense of justice that goes beyond the individual proclivities of different justices. And in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, that's exactly what the court did. They said stare decisis requires us to reaffirm the principles, even if we had disagreed with them at the very beginning, but not this court. And so that was incredibly striking to me. The second part of the opinion, and you'll excuse me, I'm going to continue to pop little lozenges for my throat. I have a nasty cold for my grandchildren, and I have lost my voice several times in the last couple of days. So if it keeps getting worse, let me know if you can't hear me. But the second thing that was really striking about this opinion is it never talked about women. The court repeatedly talked about the importance of protecting fetal life. But Justice Alito, in his lengthy opinion, never addressed the impact of the ruling on the lives of women, non-binary people, trans people, anyone in need of abortion services. And this was pretty striking. Why? Because, of course, the whole right to choose abortion was grounded on the view that childbirth is more dangerous than abortion, that forcing women to give birth against their will is an infringement on their bodily integrity, because you're forcing them to do something with their body that they don't want to do, and interferes with in my view, the most important aspect of the decision, which is the ability to choose whether or not to be a parent when that is right for you. Okay, when it is right for you and your family, after consultation with whomever you desire, whether it be your family or your doctor or your relatives or your friends, whatever those reasons, the court recognized in Roe that the right to choose abortion and to carry the pregnancy to term, both sides of the equation, are protected liberty interests under the 14th Amendment. So it was really striking to me that the court just ignored what happens to women when you ban abortion. And as the dissenting justices noted, and as we have seen just in the couple of months since the Dobbs decision was handed down, when abortion has become more and more limited across states, not just in Texas now, but your handiwork has been spread to at least 14 states around the country so far. As we've seen, it is those women without means, poor women, women who live in rural areas, women who are young, women who are disabled, women who don't have family resources to help them through hard times, Black and brown women because they face too much discrimination within the healthcare system. Those are the people who are hurt the most. Now, we know from the days that states were able to restrict abortion that those women were hurt the most. But when you ban the abortion, you are essentially saying to those very women, you have no options but to be forced to give birth against your will. So, striking in that it hit stare decisis head on, striking that it didn't talk about women, and in my view, even more striking on the breadth and the ambition of the court. These right-wing justices gave us a roadmap, not just for how to roll back a constitutional right that had been on the books for almost 50 years and had been relied upon by millions of women in this nation. They didn't just give us a roadmap for eliminating abortion, they gave us a roadmap for eliminating all unenumerated rights. Now, for those of you who aren't lawyers, and I hope that's most of you in the room, unenumerated rights means that they're not specifically mentioned. There's no the right to abortion in the words of the Constitution. Rather, they come from notions of equality and liberty in the 14th Amendment. And the court over years has said these are important rights. Now, what else is an unenumerated right? Well, the right to use contraception, the right to use in vitro fertilization or take assisted fertility treatments, the right to make decisions about one's pregnancy, the right to be sexual, either with or without people of the same sex or different sex, the right to gay marriage, lesbian and gay marriage, the right to interracial marriage, the right to travel, the right to make educational decisions about your children. All of those rights, and frankly there are many, many more, have been interpreted as part of the liberty interest of the 14th Amendment. And the Supreme Court has said this. They say if it's not specifically mentioned in the Constitution, and if it's not a part of our nation's history and tradition, then this court, it should not recognize that right as a constitutionally protected federal interest. Now that's pretty striking, right? Because it is very much the case that none of those rights are specifically enumerated, but it's also the case that they weren't a part of our nation's history and tradition. Why? Well, women weren't a part of our nation's history and tradition from the founding of the Constitution, right? It wasn't until 1920 that we actually got the right to vote. People of color, particularly Black Americans, weren't citizens of this country under the initial Constitution. So all of the history of discrimination against lesbian, gay, LGBTQ, trans Americans has been with us for, generations. So the standard that the court used in establishing what constitutes a fundamental right, what can be constitutionally protected as a basis of federal law, is impossible to meet. Now, a couple of sentences in the opinion, the throwaways from Justice Alito said, oh, well, we're just talking about abortion. Yeah, well, they're not just talking about abortion. And don't let anyone believe that they are just talking about abortion. The only one who was honest enough to really say what they are thinking was Justice Thomas. And he said it straightforward. All of those rights, in his view, should not be recognized as federal constitutional rights to protect in this country. And the coming term, we're going to see a whole lot of other types of rights. Rights around affirmative action, rights around racial justice, rights in the criminal justice arena, that I am fearful that this radical court will throw out the way that they threw out abortion rights in Dobbs. So, what happened and what do we do as a result of this? The first thing I'm going to say is we're not going to get rid of this Supreme Court right away. Right? There's no way to do that. They're young. They're going to be there for a long time. And so the first thing I want to say is let's quit hitting our heads against that marble staircase. Let's quit depending on the courts, particularly the federal courts, for the preservation of our liberties. What do we need to do? Well, while I was not surprised by the result, I was surprised by the opinion. I also haven't been surprised by how those who oppose abortion have reacted to the decision. We suggested in our book that 26 states would ban abortion within the year following Dobbs. And we picked that number because there are 26 states in this country that are controlled completely by the Republicans. They control the legislatures and they control the governorship in at least 26 states. And in some cases, they control the Supreme Courts in other states. But 26 seemed like a nice even number. And we're not quite there yet, but we're well on the way. About 14 states have banned abortion, and those bans are in effect. There's another 4 states in which special sessions are going to be called. Legislatures are going to convene probably after the election to enact new restrictions. There's another handful of states that have already passed bans, but they're being held up by litigation in state courts under arguments that state constitutional rights ought to establish or recognize the same rights that the Supreme Court recognized in Roe. And while I'm hopeful that we'll win 1 or 2 of those, I don't think we'll win many more. So we're well on our way to at least 24 states banning abortion. And what does that mean? Well, geographically, they're not kind of scattered all over the place. They're all the way across the South, from Georgia all the way west to the, well, actually now to the Oklahoma border, the western Oklahoma border, north from the Dakotas, the edge of Canada, all the way south to the Mexican border, down through the mountain states. There's a few states that aren't part of that, Colorado, New Mexico, but the rest of them will ban abortion, and that means that women only have a few options when they are facing an unintended pregnancy. The first option is to travel. Okay, and as I've already said, travel is great when you have the resources to do it and you have the information to find an appropriate level of care. The second problem with travel is it means that fewer states are inundated with the number of women in need. Now, those states probably contain about, let me go back a second. There's about 850,000 abortions a year in the United States, or people seeking abortions. There will be fewer now that these bans have been in place. But of those 850,000, probably somewhere around 400,000 are women who live in states which ban abortion. So all of those 400,000 women need to go to the states that protect the right, which are too often located on the coasts or in Illinois, the northern Midwest. And so the travel is far and maybe impossible for women without means. Now, I know many in this audience will remember the days before Roe and the airplanes that were chartered to go to New York and filled with young women in need of abortion services and, or who went to Washington State. That will happen. But like we saw in the days before Roe, not everyone could do that. And some women died as a result of forced pregnancies or otherwise trying to terminate their own pregnancies in unhealthy ways. The good news is that the traditional back alley abortion as we knew it in the days before Roe is less necessary because of the advent of medication abortion. That's an abortion pill. You take 2 pills within 2 days of each other. You can terminate a pregnancy up to 10 weeks safely. It is a safe procedure, banned still in all the states that ban abortion, but much easier to obtain clandestinely than back alley abortions, back alley surgical abortions were in the days before Roe. So the options are travel or obtain medication abortion in a safe state or in an illegal state through a gray or black market, or be forced to carry the pregnancy to term. And the irony in all of that, of course, is that the very people who are going to suffer the most because of forced childbearing are living in places which have the highest levels of maternal mortality. Alabama, Mississippi, levels of maternal mortality are equal or worse than third world nations. Okay? The black women, indigenous women die in pregnancy in many parts of the United States at 3 times the rate of white women. So the very women who are harmed the most by abortion bans are also the most likely to die because of the lack of decent maternity care services where they live. So that's the effect. I'm not surprised by any of these. And let's be clear that while the laws that have been passed, some, attached to the entire pregnancy, some attach at 5 weeks, some allow abortion up to 15 weeks, others have exceptions for rape or incest or life of the woman. But all of those laws are much more onerous and restrictive than what was on the books before Dobbs. You've probably all heard the stories, the 11-year-old incest victim in Ohio who had to go to Indiana to get an abortion, or the women facing fatal fetal anomalies that are here in Texas and had to go to Oklahoma or to other California to obtain care. And the stories that are obviously the most ironic are the women with wanted pregnancies who are forced to, are unable to get appropriate care, the ectopic pregnancy, the woman with cancer who can't terminate the pregnancy because she needs to do so in order to save her life for cancer care. The part that's amazing to me is that doctors are now relegated to their lawyer's office to determine whether or not an abortion is appropriate, rather than taking into account the needs of the women that they serve. And I have to say, politicians, and many of them are unfortunately here in Texas, are vying for the glory of enacting the most cruel and inhumane policies they can think of wanting to control not just the policies in their state, but preventing those seeking abortions from traveling to other states or obtaining information and assistance from abortion funds in their homes. And I know you've seen the news recently of the abortion fund here in Texas suing your Attorney General just for clarification about what's permitted under the law. And he doesn't even want to give them that. Has been, I guess, hiding from the process server. I thought it was kind of fun to watch him dodge the process server. But either way, access to information, access to appropriate care is really circumcised. And so I wasn't surprised by that result. I have been surprised by the response of those who believe that the right to choose abortion ought to be recognized as a fundamental right, as a human right in the world. Because, even though I know intellectually that 75% of Americans believe that the right to choose abortion ought to be left between a doctor and the woman and not regulated by the state, that number did not reflect to me the intensity and the emotion behind the response to Dobbs. And I think that the reaction was so much deeper and so much more personal than I could have imagined. Those who support abortion rights recognized immediately that the loss was just not the loss of access to medical care, but the loss of autonomy and the loss of freedom to direct one's life, and the freedom, what I think of as the freedom to be, the freedom to decide for yourself, whether, when, with whom, how to have children, and eventually the freedom to participate equally in society. Political activism was also immediate. I know probably many of you in this audience have been working for political candidates since SB 8 was first handed down. And of course, candidates and surprisingly, the Democratic Party has seized on the abortion issue and made it an issue in the midterms. And of course, for people like me who are kind of junkies on this issue, Kansas was a high point, right? Because there we saw an electorate vote down an abortion ban, not just by, a close margin in a red state, but by 18 points. And it wasn't just Democratic women, it was Democratic women and independent women and Republican women and rural women from across Kansas. And I have to say that is a good proof of the importance of the privacy of the voting booth. If there was ever a time privacy in the voting booth made a difference, it was in Kansas this year. But it seems to me, while all of those things are really good, they are only pointing the way to what we need to do now, which is to build long-term political power. As I said, saving Roe has been our strategy. We can no longer depend on the courts. We need, first and foremost, to build what I have been calling a badass social justice movement, to loudly demand change, to follow many of our sisters in countries around the world. I don't know if you've all followed the demonstrations in Poland and in Argentina and in Mexico and in Ireland, all of which are incredibly important. And why? Not because we want to be radicals in the streets, but because it raises the importance of the issue. And it may be that's a young people's job. I think we can all join in on it, but the reality is that it keeps the issue foremost in the minds of all of us. But, in my view, to really win in the long term, to preserve our victories, to repeal the bad laws, preserve our victories, enact good ones, we need to wrest the reins of political power away from those who oppose abortion. Now, that is a lifetime job, okay? It is not just this next election. Electing Beto O'Rourke as governor may be a great goal, but that's not enough, okay? This is a lifetime endeavor, and we need to be at every election, and for many of us, that's twice a year, not once a year, and that's every year, not just once every 4 years. So we need to be a part of the political process on both sides of the aisle in order to make long-lasting change. Now, I'm not going to talk to you about how to get involved in political politics. You all are very, very smart people. You know how to do that. Many of you are already involved in political activities. As a church, it's not something that you all want me to be talking about. But I think you know the way. But what I will tell you, or what I hope to leave you with, is what would happen if we actually were able to wrest the reins of power from those who want to control women, who want to take these rights away from all of us. It seems to me the good news and the heart and optimism that I feel is we can imagine a post-Roe world that protects a wide range of reproductive freedoms. We can create a future in which all people, whatever their gender, whatever their race, sexuality, identity, can freely choose to become parents when it is right for them, and that parents not only have the ability to make those decisions, but the social supports to raise their children in safety and in dignity. So picture this. When we take control of the legislative process among people who care about reproductive freedom, child care and early childhood education would be universally available and affordable, just as it is in countries around the globe. Paid maternity and paternity leaves would be available for all working parents. According to the Center for Disease Control, Black and brown women die more in pregnancy. I've talked about that before. Well, in our new world, we would have programs to reduce that alarmingly high rate of maternal mortality, and also at the same time reduce the infant mortality that often occurs as well. We'd focus on eradicating infertility and expanding access to health care at all stages of women's lives, and even those in my view, even those who oppose abortion, should be getting on board with all of those things. But if we had political power, we would do more. The birth control pill would be available over the counter, like you can buy a box of Tylenol. Okay? That is available over the counter in countries all over the world, but not here in the United States. Quality sex education would be a standard part of our curriculum in all public schools. Laws like the Don't Say Gay bills, or those that penalize trans parents for trying to help their kids, they would be history. The book bans that we're seeing that relegate award-winning fiction to the trash heap because they happen to discuss issues of gender and sexuality. I mean, it's just astonishing what we could do if we had political power to do so. And of course, we ensure that everyone had access to safe and legal abortion. No more bans, no more hurdles, no more funding restrictions, just the ability to obtain health care when you need it. And medication abortion, as I described, would be available, again, not behind closed doors, not requiring women to jump through hoops, but available like the birth control pill is, and like it is available in countries, actually just across the Mexican border, in other countries around the world. So let me just leave you with this, which is that all of these reforms are possible. They're admirable. They're things we ought to be setting our minds to, but they won't happen unless we also decide to be political. To say we will work for candidates who believe in reproductive freedom, and we will make sure that once they're in office, they implement the policies that reflect reproductive freedom. I'm going to leave you with a quote from my favorite singer. Let me add one more thing, which is, if we had the political power to do so, in addition to all those statutory remedies I've mentioned, I am hopeful that we would pass a constitutional amendment that explicitly protects not just abortion rights, but protects LGBTQ, protects women's equality, protects the rights that this court is going to eradicate over the next couple of years. That is a long-term goal, but is one that can be built upon the backs of those who fought for the ERA and begin to reflect what's really necessary in this country and not relegate this issue to each election. And then it seems to me, while the circumstances today are incredibly dire, women are suffering, the death of Roe is not the end of the story. To paraphrase Joan Baez, one of my favorite singers of all time, the best antidote to despair is action. So I urge us all, because we have the potential to realign the political system in this country, I urge us all to take action as soon as possible. Thank you. Let's do it.
Okay, now it's time for you to say what's on your mind and questions you might have. We have two mic runners, and please wait until you have a microphone before you ask a question. And if you hold the microphone like this, you will be heard. If you hold it down here, you won't. So, fire away. How many have a question? Raise your hand.
You know what, let me just come down. I'm mic'd, right, so I can come down. It's just either feels so far away.
Do you think there's any hope with the lawsuits that are being filed that the Roe v. Wade interferes with their religious rights?
Use your mic, please.
That it interferes with their religious rights?
Am I hopeful? No.
No.
No. Because remember,
Were they filed, though?
they were filed. There were the groups in Florida that filed federal lawsuits asking the court to recognize a religious interest. First of all, that case has already been decided by the court. In 1980, we raised those issues in a case called Harris versus McRae. The court rejected the Establishment Clause argument. They said there wasn't a plaintiff in the religious freedom argument to raise the question, because it was groups like those who filed the suits in Florida who were trying to represent the interests of their penitents, not themselves. But either way, even if they got the right plaintiff, and it's possible, I once had the right plaintiff who was just think about this, trying to find the right plaintiff, a Jewish woman on Medicaid who was dying and was pregnant and wanted an abortion. Like, trying to put that together in one person was pretty difficult. I had that. Unfortunately, she died before the case could be completed, but it's really hard to find the right plaintiff. But more than anything, we don't have the votes on this court for anything good about abortion, okay? And that's why I keep saying, quit depending on the federal courts. They're not going to help us. And even if they help us temporarily, which isn't a bad thing, to, get a couple extra months or get a year or two if you could get an injunction, it's not going to solve the problem.
Thank you very much for a very interesting and intriguing presentation from someone who's really been there and knows exactly what they're talking about. My question is about stare decisis. I'm not in favor of what happened by any means, but how can one overturn a law that really was not right? Just the fact that it's precedent, that it's been there for years, doesn't necessarily make it correct or right. So correct or right. So in calling stare decisis a means or a reason for which a law should not be overturned seems a little troubling to me.
Okay, so the Supreme Court, in my case, in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, really talked very specifically about the importance of stare decisis. And what they said was, you can overturn a bad decision if there is a change in fact or a change in the law in over a period of time. But you can't do it because you disagreed with the original decision. You have to do it because there has been some circumstances that warrant the change. And we've seen in many instances, the Supreme Court of the United States overturned bad precedent, usually in an effort to expand rights rather than to contract them. So, for example, you'll excuse me, I'm doing this lozenge on my throat, you can hear me. But for example, Plessy versus Ferguson was overturned in Brown versus Board of Education. Why? Because circumstances had changed, but most importantly, the law had changed moving up to it. And they were expanding the rights recognized under the Constitution. Gay marriage, in some ways, overturned prior precedent that had said gay marriage shouldn't be recognized as a constitutional right. So I'm not saying there's never circumstances, but in this case, okay, the only difference, remember the court as early as recently as 2015 and 2016 had reaffirmed the right to choose abortion. The only difference was the composition of the court. And to me, that is the problem, which is the Supreme Court of the United States ought to be an institution that is hallowed. It has power because of the respect that we as Americans give our court. It doesn't have power because it has any inherent right to do anything. Right? Remember, the Supreme Court isn't going to call up the militia to enforce what their rulings are. Right? They can enforce their rulings because we respect their rulings. And that is based on a respect for the institution of the court. And when we as a public see that court making changes based on the politics of the people that are appointed rather than the rule of law, to me, that's the really disturbing part of what's going on. And it's striking to me. I think we're now down to approval of the Supreme Court is around 26, 27%. Totally awful, in my view. As somebody who, I've argued 2 cases there, I respect the notion of a court. I respect and want to have an institution that protects individual liberties against the power of the legislatures. I'm talking to you about being political, but in my preferred world, these would be recognized constitutional rights because the majority doesn't always get it right. And so I think that that's really the stare decisis standard. And the reason that it goes back so long in our history is because the court is looked at as a, how do you say this? It's looked at as a stabilizing influence in society, as something that doesn't change quickly or radically from one place to another or from person to person, but something in which we can all rely. And in Casey, the reason that the justices relied so heavily on stare decisis is because they said millions of American women had relied upon their prior rulings, and that reliance on those rulings was incredibly important, and we ought to make sure that they're able to do so going forward.
Thank you, I understand now.
Good. Come on. No more questions? All right.
Hello. Do you have any insight into why the Democrats in Congress haven't taken any action to pass legislation that might guarantee some federal reproductive health rights?
Well, the House has passed the Reproductive Health Act. It has not been passed in the Senate because they don't have the votes. In order to get anything through the Senate, you need a filibuster-proof majority. Got to be able to break the filibuster. And you can't do that because Manchin and Sinema are against breaking the filibuster. We can't get voting rights through the Senate. We can't get abortion rights through the Senate. I'll wait to see whether or not we can actually get LGBTQ rights for gay marriage through the Senate. They're holding it past the election on the hope that maybe there'll be 10 Republican votes. I doubt it. So there's lots of things that are held up. And so one of the things that I say to people and how important it is it may be a while before we have the House, the Senate, which is a Senate that can overcome the filibuster or willing to change the filibuster rule, and the presidency in support of abortion rights. That could be a long time. What we can change is states. And while that's hard work to change states one at a time, we need to start doing that. Here in Texas, you all probably think, oh my God, we're never going to do that. Well, you can do that. I remember the day Ann Richards was governor of Texas. Right? How many of you remember when Ann Richards was governor? All right. Okay? So it can happen. Now, it will be harder because there's, restrictions on voting. It will be harder because districts have been gerrymandered in terms of the legislature. But it can happen. And what does it take? Hard work. Elections are not, there's no one who can't influence an election. Because all you need to do is knock on lots of doors, write lots of postcards, make lots of phone calls, give lots of money. All of these are things we know how to do. And, look at it in Texas, like, you think, oh, it can't happen. Well, how close did Beto come to defeating Cruz in the Senate race? Was it 3 points? That's not that many when you figure that half the people in your state don't vote. Okay? All you need to do is find 5% who don't vote and get them voting, and you could have won that election. Okay, so I think that what we are too often fraught with is that kind of being frozen when we can't get it right away. And years and years ago, when I was a teenager, I went on a visit to Israel and to France with my parents. And I met a woman there in France who had been a survivor of the Holocaust. And she looked at me, I asked her some questions, and she was talking about U.S. domestic politics. And she looked with me and she said, "What is it with you Americans? You always think it has to happen right away." And that stuck with me for a long time, that we have to start thinking not just in the short term, not just in November, but the 50-year plan to get that constitutional amendment passed and work toward it until my grandchildren can have the rights that I once enjoyed. Because it may take that long to do. But if it is a lifetime endeavor, then we think about it in a slightly different way, and I'm hopeful. The second thing to that question is, everybody says to me, well, why didn't Biden do more? Well, he didn't do more because he doesn't have the power to do a whole lot, okay? He's the president. He can't create legislation. He can change the regulations of the federal government. Well, it's hard to do. I mean, maybe he could have a few doctors that work for the Veterans Administration do abortions for veterans, but then there's the Hyde Amendment that prevents spending on that. I mean, there's all kinds of limitations in federal law that prevent the president from acting. Now, it seems to me the FDA could do a lot by approving over-the-counter birth control pills, by liberalizing how you can get the abortion pill, but that the president can't do. And that has to be for medical reasons, not for political ones. So that may take a while. And I think what we're left with is just getting down to work and knocking on doors and talking to our friends. And for those, how many of you lived here in Texas before Roe? Okay, so you remember. Okay. There's not that many of you in the world that can talk to other people about those memories. I'm 70 years old. I went to college in 1970 in New York State, which was the year abortion was legalized there. So anyone younger than me does not remember the days before legal abortion. But you all do, and I urge you to talk about that publicly. Because everyone has a story, and if they don't have a personal story, you got a story of another friend of yours, you got a story of somebody you knew, or you got a story. And that's really important, because young people don't, they get it a little bit. But the reality is that they only get it when it happens to them, or they think they're going to be pregnant. And it's important for us to break down the myths of what happens in those when abortion is banned. And so that's an extra thing besides knocking on doors that you all can do to talk about what life was like before Roe.
Not specifically about abortion rights, but since you talked about the court and politics, I'd like to know your view about what the rules of recusal should be, not only in Justice Thomas's case, but in general.
Well, first of all, I think the Supreme Court ought to have the same ethical rules of every other federal judge, and frankly, the same ethical rules of other political animals, whether they're members of Congress or the president. I think the court should not be immune to ethics. And I think it's an outrage that Justice Thomas didn't recuse himself on a case in which his wife was directly involved in the activity at issue. If it isn't a direct conflict, it's an appearance of conflict, that should be the standard. That's the standard for everybody else. So yes, he should have recused himself. Will he? Probably not. Why not? Because the same arrogance that led to the decision in Dobbs and led to his view that all enumerated rights ought to be taken away, the same view that in his view is, abortion is akin to slavery, all of those radical views are who he is. And remember, he got on the court after accusations of sexual harassment, that have clearly proven true in the intervening years with additional witnesses who've come forward. So, I don't have much sympathy for Justice Thomas, but I also think it's really important, because we want the court to be viewed as respected institution, that they have really, they have the obligation to not just decide things willy-nilly, but to do so with ethical standards. And I can't figure out why Roberts is sitting around and not calling for that. That just seems crazy to me.
I'm really not sure that this is on.
It's off by itself. There you go. I don't know how to ask this question. My dad was a lawyer and a judge. He was very logical. I was a social worker. I'm very emotional. When you talk about trying to convince people to vote for your candidate, how do you respond when they say, "Are you a baby killer? Are you one of those people that are a feminist?" And I was actually in the grocery store one time, and I happened to have a t-shirt on that I got when I was in Maine. And this guy came up to me and said, "Hey, you a Yankee?" And how? And I said, "No, I just came back from a visit." But I mean, in Texas, you can get shot from people who disagree with you. So how do you deal with that?
Well, I say to all of you, we don't need to convince the people who disagree with us. We just need to activate those who do. Remember, 75% of Americans believe that this is a decision that ought to rest between a woman and her doctor and not regulated by the state. 66% believe Roe is the appropriate standard of law. Okay, it shouldn't be overruled. We don't have to convince anyone on the other side, which is much closer to about 33%. That can't win an election. We got to get the 66% or the 75% to vote on this issue and to turn out to vote. And that means registering them and turning them out, because a lot of them aren't registered. They don't currently vote. So I just say, you know, I don't often, but from time to time, you know, the hecklers will come in and when I'm talking and try to convince me. And, you know, my reality is I'm going to be polite. I'm going to be firm in my view, but I don't care what you believe, because you're not politically important if we're going to win. And that is a very practical point of view. It's a little, you know, for those of us who like to have everybody feel good and get along, it doesn't really work. But, you know, I practiced law in the days when my clients were being firebombed, so we weren't getting along for a long time. So in that sense, I gave up on that.
We aren't doctors in all this. Have they
Wait for the microphone.
in the Dobbs case? I mean, are they like mobilizing to, what can they do?
So both the American Medical Association, American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the American Academy of Pediatrics, they've all been great on this issue over the years. They've filed amicus briefs in the courts. But I think doctors, like most of us, have relied on the courts. You don't have to get down and dirty to file an amicus brief in the Supreme Court, right? Your lawyers do that. You know, those of us who worked on this issue helped them write those briefs. That's not a big deal. They now are understanding how difficult it is when they can't provide care to their patients and they end up spending hours in the lawyer's office at the hospital to decide what they can or can't do. And I have to tell you, some of the most politically activated people I've met in the last 2 months have been doctors who say, "Oh my God, I can't live like this." The problem is, they're probably all going to be moving just to the blue states. And that just, exacerbates the problem even worse, because it means not only can't you get abortion care, but you can't get maternity care. OBGYNs are really rare in many parts of this country. So when you have a mass exodus from the red states that have passed bans of doctors who provide these kinds of services, it affects everybody's health. I mean, I don't know how many of you understand that Planned Parenthood, right, which is also one of the largest providers of health, of abortion services is the primary place young people go for primary health care. Because when do young people need health care? Well, they get their period. They need birth control. They want to talk about contraception. They've missed a period and they can't figure out what's going on with their body. Who do they call? They call Planned Parenthood. So when Planned Parenthoods close, because they lose the revenue from abortion services, it affects primary health care for just huge numbers of women, and that is a problem. So again, we need to think about how we support those doctors to do the kinds of care they're unable to do. But as we know, under the Texas law, it's really hard to tell what's legal and what isn't. I have to tell you, I have great trepidations coming to Texas. Because if I told any of you how to get an abortion, I could be arrested. Or I could be sued by a vigilante who believes that you all shouldn't have that information. And that is extremely problematic. Years ago, this is a great story, I don't know how, it's like right after, maybe it was somewhere around 1990 or 1991, I was working, I did the work from home thing, different, well before it became a fad in the post-COVID years. But I was working from home and my office was in my bedroom, and I get this, do you all remember call waiting? Okay, so I'm on the phone with my office in New York at the ACLU, and I get a call waiting, and I pick up the other line. And it is a woman in Guam who said, I was told to call you, Guam just voted, the legislature in Guam just voted to ban abortion. And I want some help. And I hung up with her and said, we'll be back to you. Of course, we'll try to help. Did the other half of the call waiting, talked to Janet Benchoff, who was running the ACLU's Reproductive Freedom Project at the end, and she said, I'm going to Guam. And then there was like, get me a plane, get me a guidebook, tell me where I'm going. I have no idea where Guam really is. And she literally 2 hours later drives out to Kennedy Airport and hops on a plane and goes to Guam. In Guam, the head of the legislature, who was the sponsor of the bill, was the mother of the woman who called me. Okay, so Anita was a lawyer in Guam, and Anita, it was on our side of this issue, decided we needed to sue her mother and the Commonwealth. It turns out Guam is like the United States, it's governed by US law. So that law, like the Texas law, had a provision which is you couldn't, not only could you not get abortion, but you couldn't provide information about abortion. And the reason I'm telling you the story is so Janet, who's obviously braver than I, went to the National Press Club of Guam, which is a room probably about this size, and stood at a podium and said, I am telling you today that every woman on this island has a right to choose abortion. You can go to Planned Parenthood in Hawaii. Here is how you can get airplane tickets. Here is how you can call them for an appointment. And the Attorney General of Guam was waiting outside the door and wanted to arrest her as she was walking. So she climbed out the window of the bathroom, turned herself in a couple days later, made headlines all over the world about the importance of being able to provide information. We won those lawsuits going forward. But I am always struck by the bravery of people who stand up and do the right thing when the law tells you you can't. And that brings me to the abortion funds in Texas who need your support, who are doing the right thing to help women get access to abortion, who are helping them in a way as much as they can legally to do so. We need more people like Janet and like the abortion funds around the country.
I can talk loudly, but how big of an issue do you think this will be? Oh, okay, I'm sorry about that. Yeah. How big of an issue do you think this will be in the midterms? You mentioned the Kansas example we saw there, but midterms coming up. What's your prediction?
Well, there's a couple of my predictions, who knows? It's really hard to tell. I mean, traditionally, the midterms ought to be a time in which Democrats lose a large number of seats. The tradition has always been that when the president is in power, the opposing party gains somewhere between 30 to 50 seats in the House, and usually control of the opposing party. So if tradition holds, abortion will not affect the election. On the other hand, special elections that have been held and the Kansas vote point to at least a lot of angry women and men who care about this issue. So there's some anger and there's some motivation. Will it be enough? It's hard to tell, because enough has to overcome inflation, a belief that the economy is going to pot, not very high approval ratings of our president. So all of those things are a problem. But I think in certain places we can do better than expected, and B, win races that we didn't expect to win. And I'm just going to keep my fingers crossed. I live in Pennsylvania, so I have a crazy person running for governor, and abortion. I can't even tell you how crazy this guy is. I mean, he's not even in the news much because he won't talk to the media, except if you're a right-wing media, so it's hard to but he's just he does amazing things. I'm very confident abortion has become a big issue in the gubernatorial race, and I'm confident that Josh will win. It probably would have been a little closer without abortion. On the other hand, the Senate race, Dr. Oz versus John Fetterman, it's getting close. I mean, abortion was helping John. I'm not sure it'll be enough to pull him through. So, we'll see. It is. That's why I start with the proposition that it's not just in November that we have to pay attention. Now, I would love it if you guys could just join the MAGA group here in Texas, the Mothers Against Greg Abbott, and retire him from office, because in my view, that'd be a great message to send around the country. If Greg Abbott could be defeated, even if the Attorney General could be defeated. Yeah, well, yes, all of the above. But if we don't want to get greedy, even the Attorney General, okay, that would be really great, because those are the kinds of elections that send messages to other people. For example, early on in my career, there were two members of the Pennsylvania legislature who were the leaders of everything bad. And when we were able to defeat both of them in the same election, we didn't see a new restriction on abortion for the next 10 years. Because that's sending a message that other legislators get to. And so that's why these kind of high-profile races are really important.
When you were speaking about the slippery slope that this decision created, how do we change the dialogue to help those who are undecided or who are on the other side recognize, yes, you're preventing me from having a choice, but you've allowed a door to be opened that will prevent you from making choices and decisions in your own lives, things that we may not have even recognized at this point.
Yeah, the problem is consistency is still the hobgoblin of little minds. I mean, let's remember that bodily integrity and autonomy was the main argument those who opposed vaccines and masks use. So I don't think there's not a good sense of consistency here in terms of what works and what doesn't. And actually, personal interest isn't always important. Power is what's going on here. We're talking about power. And the only way you take back power is to have the numbers. And again, I would, let me just say, I'm a lawyer. I believe in reasoned arguments. I believe in reasoned and reasonable arguments, right? I spent my life making arguments. But arguments don't work when the numbers don't. Okay, we come back to those 5 in the Supreme Court. If there are 5 votes against you, I could be the most brilliant lawyer in the creation of the world, and it would not help one bit. And that's true in legislatures as well. The people who do respond to what you're suggesting are those who think they're going to lose power. Okay, so there's, in any legislature, there are, you know, I used to say there's a third who supports you 100%. There's a third who's against you 100%. And there's a third in the middle who's picking up their finger and trying to figure out which way is the wind blowing. Okay? That's the third we need on our side. And that's why high-profile defeats or wins in close elections make a big difference. And let me just say, I spent a lot of time in the Pennsylvania trying to flip the Pennsylvania legislature since 2017. In 2018, there were 15 seats, and we have a big legislature, so 15 was not a huge number, but we had 15 seats where our people lost by less than 1,500 votes. Okay? And I bet if you look at some of the races in Texas, they were also lost or won by equally small margins, because state legislative districts, especially House districts, are pretty small. It doesn't take that many votes to win. I used to say, my God, just buy a pizza for everybody instead of spending all that money in their campaigns, because there aren't that many people in the district. Candidates can actually talk to them all. So yes, I think those are the people, that third in the middle, who respond to good arguments, or at least a willingness to think differently because they're afraid of losing their seat. Paul, I know you had a question.
Well, I did have a question. I was just about to say, well, we're at the end of our questions. You speak with such confidence, and you're obviously so informed, but can you go back to somebody in their early 30s who was arguing in front of the Supreme Court for the first time? What was that experience like?
Scary. The first time I argued was a case called Thornburg versus American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. It was pretty much the exact same case as Casey, and was a challenge to restrictions on abortion. At the time, it was 1986. My son had just been born, so I was just kind of coming back from maternity leave very quickly to write the briefs in that case and to argue that case. I remember 2 really distinctive things. One was the scary dreams of, like standing up before the court and not having your skirt on, right? I mean, that was like the scariest dreams of all. And right before Casey, a reporter who remembered that dream of mine reminded me exactly that. And the second was, of course, there was no women's bathroom in the Supreme Court for lawyers. The lawyer's bathroom was male, because that's who argued in the Supreme Court. So it was it was an interesting time. It was the Reagan administration and Ed Meese and the moral majority began to align. And I actually think back about those years in 85, 86, 87 as the defining moment of how opponents of abortion began to win. And they did so because they aligned with the Republican Party. And that was basically the moral majority and the religious right that found a way to convince the Republicans that they needed their support to win elections. And ever since then, I think we've gone downhill. So I won Thornburg by 1 vote. It was 5-4 in support of total reaffirmation of Roe, but because it went from 6-3 to 5-4, the headline on Thornburg was 1 vote away from overturning the court. And then we kept getting that headline for the next 35 years until they finally did it.
So, any other pressing questions? Okay, let me give you the mic.
Just recently here in Texas, the maternal death rate that they usually put out suddenly were stopped because they said they didn't know how the data was being collected in the state, so that was their excuse. Yeah. So even when you have the numbers and then you hide the numbers,
right?
What are we going to do?
Well, you know, that was a tactic Ronald Reagan used. He eliminated the Centers for Disease Control's collection of abortion statistics. And just by doing that, we now have the Alan Guttmacher Institute who collects the same statistics that the federal government used to keep, but that was one unilateral move by the president.
So when you talk about we're going to have evidence, unfortunately, I think all of us are looking at this right now and realizing that it might take 20 years for us to look at those maternal deaths, to look at the fetal deaths, to look at the suicides that will occur for women that don't want to continue with these pregnancies. And there's just so many negative things, but it might take another 20 years.
Yeah, I had the pleasure a couple weeks ago of meeting with Faye Waddleton, who many of you remember was the president of Planned Parenthood for so many years. And she kept saying to me, you know, we can do everything right, and women are going to die. Mm-hmm. I mean, women are going to lose their fertility. Women are going to be harmed. There is no way around that. And it's really awful. And it's not, you know, rich women will do fine, but it's poor women and women without means, and frankly, it's young women. I mean, that just is the part that just their whole lives are going to be changed because they're forced to be parents before they are ready. There's no way around that bad news. But we have to have hope. And our collective hope, our hope that we can make a difference in the world, comes from our energy and our enthusiasm and our willingness to get to work. And so yes, it's a lifetime endeavor, but let's make it fun, right? Let's go knock on doors with my friends. Let's go with your friends. You know, let's have a group of people in wherever you're living, talk to a group of teenagers. I mean, make it fun. Because if it has to be a long-time endeavor, if it has to be something we do, we need to do it consistently, and we won't do it if we think it's just too depressing.
Well, several years ago, as part of the American Association of University Women, went to Washington and looked out the window from their headquarters to look at an abortion clinic when the women trying to get in were being harassed as they were walking in. And, you know, we have a big fight to continue this.
We do. We do, but you're up for it. You're capable of doing it. And you don't have to do it alone. And I think that's really the message I want to leave you with, which is, let's have fun. You know, I wish I was a football coach, right? Let's go out there and get them. I can't quite do that. But I do think you all can make a difference. I wouldn't be here tonight unless you all can make a difference. And I thank you for your time and your energy going forward.
Wow. She's something. If you could all remain seated just for a moment. Kathryn, Susan, can you show her over to where the book signing is going to be?
Yeah, let me grab my stuff up there. Thanks.
We are having a reception now, and you are all cordially invited to join us there. It's an opportunity for you to purchase one of her books. Brazos books will be there. And also just some informal conversation, not that it's been all that formal. If you enjoyed the program, and maybe that's the wrong word, if it was interesting, we would like to continue bringing speakers of this caliber to Houston. So if you would consider making a donation to help cover the expenses of this, there's information on the back of your program about how you can do it, or you can drop $1 or $2 in the basket on your way out. We'd really appreciate that. Thank you so much for coming. And join us for reception.